El Rancho de las Golondrinas. We're a living history museum located just south of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the beautiful and historic La Cienega Valley. Today, we're going to learn all about baking in a traditional New Mexican horno. Joining me today is volunteer and bread baker Frances Sosa to talk more about the histories of these wonderful outdoor ovens and the process of baking and cooking in them. If at any time during this program you have any questions for Frances, make sure to include those in the comments. We hope you enjoy. Frances, take it away.
Hello. So we're going to discuss and demonstrate, make some food on the mud brick wood-fired oven. So this is a traditional item here in New Mexico. It's been here about 400 or 500 years. Now, this technology came to New Mexico with the Spaniards when they came in the 1600s, early 1630s, thereabouts. But it did not originate there. This technology was brought over from North Africa, where they use adobes for their buildings, for their ovens. They brought that technology, the horno, the mud brick ovens, to Spain when they conquered Spain. And they conquered Spain in the 700s. And they were there till about 1492. And this technology came across with the Spaniards when they came to the New World. It is basically a round, conical surface, just like you can see it here, made out of adobes, wood, mud bricks, and then plastered on the inside and outside with mud bricks. There's a little opening at the back that lets out the smoke, and we have built a fire in here. It's already burnt down to embers. So we don't leave the coals in there. We remove all that, the coals and the ash, we remove it, we sweep it out, we mop it out, and we use the residual heat to cook our bread, to cook our pies, dry our meats, dry our vegetables. This is something that would have been done probably once a week. It takes a lot of the community's resources to run this, because you have to have a good sized fire in it for a period of time, so you have to go haul wood. For those people like me that heat their houses with wood, we know how much of a dedicated time and energy that is. So they would be using this oven to cook for their family or the community, depending on how large a village they are in. And they would use every bit of the heat. So the initial heat would probably be used to bake their breads, do the pies, and as the oven cools, they would be drying vegetables or drying meats, all those things that would require a longer period of time in the oven. Today what I've got is bread. These are rolls and loaves. They've suffered a little bit for waiting for me, but they are still nice. And I've also got here 2 pies. Now, I tried to use what would normally be available at this time of the year, and I made the pies in a native traditional flat pie kind of stuff. So I've got one pie that is dried plums, prunes, and raisins. So that material would be boiled together for a while, and it would be sweetened traditionally with sorghum, because sugar was not something that was readily available. This other pie here is what we would call a pumpkin pie, but it's actually made with Hubbard squash. Hubbard squash is much sweeter than what you would call your jack-o'-lantern squash, as most people that do gardening would already know. Okay, so at this point, I don't want to lose any more of my heat in the oven, and I'm going to shovel out the ashes. So I'm going to start out with gathering the ashes. I've got a nice long metal hoe and I'm using it to gather the ashes up to the door. And then I'll shovel them out. There really isn't very much second chance with this. If the oven is not hot enough, you would have to start from beginning and start making a new fire in it. And if it's too hot, you would have a little bit more flexibility in that part of the process that I use is mopping the ashes out, so the mop actually cools the oven down a bit. So that it's too hot, you've got that way to remediate your problem. And how do you tell if it's hot enough? Well, here at the rancho, what we do is we use a little bit of wool. I'll show you in just a second. I'm going to put a little ball of wool in here and see how long it takes it to change colors from getting heat exposed. So I've got several pieces of wool here that were previously used. So if the wool turns a very dark color, then you know it's a little too warm in there. You want it to look like just a perfect marshmallow. And we're going to see how well we're going to do today right now. And so basically you're putting it in there and seeing how quickly it turns colors. And it's going to be a fairly cool oven, unfortunately. But we're going to go anyway. Yeah. And hardly any color change at all. So I'm going to quickly finish cleaning out the oven so that I can put my bread in. As is with all kinds of low-tech kind of activities, you can't be precise. And yes, it's an old-fashioned mop. I don't know if you can hear the hiss, but that's what happens. Just cleaning it out a little bit. I don't want to get it too cooled, but we'll go with what we've got. When the rancho is open and functioning normally, it's always a treat for all our visitors to have fresh bread. Oh, yes. You'll notice that there's an opening there. Of course there is. It's a door. And we close the door with a wooden door, and we have soaked the door in water. If we hadn't, it would be very likely that we would simply have a wooden door that would burst into flames in the middle of the process. So there you have preparing the horno for baking bread, and that part of the process using the heat to bake bread.
Frances,
Yes.
how long does it take for the horno to get to the ideal temperature for baking? And then once the breads and things are inside, about how long is the wait time before they're ready?
Well, if you've got a good sized flame in there, which we did, it would take probably an hour and a half, honest to goodness, because the heat has to be absorbed by the adobe. Anybody that has lived in an adobe house can tell you that an adobe house stays warm in the winter and cool in the summer. But there's a few little facts about that. The thing is that an adobe, the heat will go through the adobe, and once the entire adobe is heated, then it just goes through. So you'll lose heat. And in the summertime, of course, the heat's going the other way into the house. So modern insulation is a wonderful item. But it takes about an hour and a half at a good flame to heat up the entire oven. And then, unfortunately, it will cool fairly quickly. So we have blocked up the little chimney here to avoid that form of heat loss. And if you've got a really good hot oven, you can bake all this bread in less than 20 minutes. I suspect it's going to take us quite a bit longer than that, simply because the oven was not at optimal heat. So I can expect half an hour, 40 minutes to cook everything that went in there. And that's the luck of the draw right now. Okay. The breads, we used regular commercial yeast to make the dough. In the past, wild yeasts were the only thing that was available, or a starter that was handed down in the family. I've actually had a couple of friends who've developed their own wild yeast starts, and they did that simply but with commercial flour and water and letting it start bubbling over a week. And that seems to work really well, although I've noticed with those starts, it really gets much better after a couple of months. The yeast develop a much sharper flavor and are much more pleasant. So like I said, in addition to baking your weekly breads, you would be drying your vegetables. Of course, 'tis the season now where you would have already done your dried squash. You can dry tomatoes. Of course, you can dry chili. Anybody that's had dried green chili will tell you how much sweeter and different the flavor is on dried green chili. Squashes, a lot of people have never had those flavors of dried squash or dried onions. They are wonderful, and it's something that was of value not only nutritionally, but a treat for the family. Of course, you've always got prunes, plums, turn into prunes. You get dried apricots. New Mexico has quite beautiful apricots. In Placitas, where I come from, there's either glut or famine every year, because A lot of the early flowering fruits will get frozen very quickly. Okay. What else can I talk about for the couple of minutes that we've got here? I've got interesting things about the Horno itself. Like I said, the technology comes from Africa. Other technologies that came with them, the Spanish, to New Mexico, included our doors that have got very low entryways and steps that are high, so if you're going to go through the door, you have to step over and crouch down to get into the door. That's something that came from North Africa. It was a defensive mechanism, so that if you were in the house and a person came in that was wanting to cause you harm, they had to slow down to get through the door. That should have given you at least enough time to hit them with something large or run like the Dickens. So other little pieces of technology that came to us from North Africa.
Frances, we notice here we've got two hornos in our Golondrinas placita. They're slightly different shaped. Maybe one is a little smaller. Are these the typical standard size that you'll see in New Mexico, or can they be any size, or how much does this size play into its cooking or baking ability?
The size of the horno depends on what you're going to be using it for. The larger hornos, you can see on the pueblos, they will have a large horno if they're going to be primarily preparing goods for feast days or for selling. The smaller ones, it's just how much capacity. There's lots of people that are known for making particularly nice hornos, and they are very happy to make your horno for you, and they will charge you for that privilege. Yes. But there's also available all kinds of information on making a mud brick oven. The New Mexico Magazine put out a wonderful book that I've had for many years, just because you can tell it's all beat up. But it actually has a section in there on how to make your own horno. It also has information on making traditional pies. You have to use your different pie doughs for making empanaditas. Different people fry empanaditas. They will bake empanaditas. And there's different doughs that you can make for these flat pies as they stand. It's historically of importance to note that bread is associated with the coming of the military into New Mexico. The military wanted to have fresh flour for their troops. Flour does not last very long. It'll go bitter, rancid, within 10 days to 2 weeks once it's ground from the grain. So they actually provided contracts to the people in New Mexico that allowed them to purchase the wheels and the materials to make the big mills and provide great growth in their communities, in addition to being able to provide the flour for the military that was coming through in New Mexico. That was in the oh heavens to Betsy.
Starting about 1846.
About 1846, thank you, Laura. And so that made a big change in the communities. The availability of flour, the availability of the technology to improve their communities. Not only to grind their flours, but they were able to get the materials to mill lumber. Before that, it was primarily dirt floors, and so all the ritzy people about that time were able to afford sawn boards for their floors in their houses. when I first came to the rancho, I was looking at some buildings, and I walked in, and it sounded just like my grandmother's house sounded. You would walk in, and the boards would creak, and the mattresses with the exposed springs. All of those things were so demonstrative of changes in the community as development came through into New Mexico. Eventually, with the railroad, they were bringing in items like mattresses and steel, so people didn't have to make their rakes out of fortunately shaped branches. They were able actually to trade for steel, metal tools. This brought a whole lot of social changes in our communities, but that is nothing we can change now.
And how wonderful that even with the influx of all the new technology that came into New Mexico during that time, even to this day, we still maintain these old technologies of the hornos. And I have to say, personally, I think things taste better when they're cooked in the horno. And Frances,
Yes.
can you tell us a little bit more about the cooking process? You mentioned we can cook other things besides baked goods in the horno. How different is the process from, say, a loaf of bread to chili or even a goat leg or something of that nature?
It's a matter of higher heat. So you're going to be cooking in these items. I don't know that they would be cooking just a dinner. Perhaps once a week when they had the horno going, they would be dedicating some space and time to making their enchiladas. I mean, isn't that something that requires baking, your enchiladas? You would be roasting your red chilies in there. You could make all kinds of interesting flavors with red chili, green chili, with your garlics, onions. These were all items that were easy to grow in the area. There are some kinds of onions that are particular to our area of the Southwest. One's called a walking onion, and that is a rather interesting creature in that it puts out a head and a bulb of flowering onions, and then from that little head it will put out another bunch of arms, put out another head, and eventually it becomes so heavy that it falls over and then it roots. So consequently the name walking onions. These kind of items that we use to flavor our foods were something that was very important because we all work very hard at trying to make our lives as pleasant as we can with good foods. So onions and garlics and chives, these items could be preserved and be readily available in their gardens. I'm starting to smell bread. Thank goodness. The problem with our ovens in this one is that you don't open the door and take a peek, because then you're going to be in deeper trouble. But so
Now, Frances, historically speaking, in New Mexico, who would have done the building of the hornos and who would have done the majority of the cooking?
well, I think those division of labor might be pretty typical. In the Native American families now, the building of the ovens is given over to the men, and there are particular people that are very skilled in it. Of course, baking and grinding foods, again, that goes to the women. In terms of grinding, say, corn, in the Native American customs, that is something that is only permitted by the women. Men are not permitted to grind corn. Um, so these are cultural choices, and currently I suspect that any woman worth her salt could make an Horno quite easily. Just like any man could cook himself some good foods. And so,
Now, Francis, here in the Golondrinas Placita, we have one of our spaces here that's designated as La Cocina, or the kitchen, where some food preparation and certainly some cooking would have been done. But of course, a large majority of the cooking is done outside. Can you talk about why that is, the advantage to that, and is this something that they would have done all year, even now in the winter months?
pretty much. The cocina is where they would be storing their beans in large containers. For instance, one of the large containers that we have in our cocina is actually a hollowed out log. Beans and such like that would be kept there, but it wouldn't be a matter of keeping all of your stock there. They would be having subterráneos, they would have underground storage where it was cool, where they could keep vermin and such out. So they would have their cooking materials here. They would also have an interior chimneyed cooking space. Our particular area also has what's referred to as a shepherd's bed. That's not where the shepherd sleeps. That warm area right by the cooking stove would be where infants were kept, where small animals were kept, lambs and such. Anybody who's raised sheep know that they are inclined to produce twins and sometimes triplets. And so the mother will push away what she cannot feed. And any farmer worth his salt knows that he's going to be having to keep as much as he can alive. So he will bring in the lambs that are pushed away by the moms and keep them in the on the shepherd's bed. Of course, feeding these little animals, that becomes the job of the children, so that they can make sure that the lambs stay alive. And of course, as soon as they get big enough to start jumping off of the shepherd's bed, out they go, because they're big enough to be taken care of outside. Of course, this was all, like I said, this would be where infants are watched, and also the elderly and the infirm and the sick would be taken care of in there. We've got a lovely example of a crib, which is just a hanging rectangle on leather ropes, and there's a little
I
leather,
believe it's a sheepskin.
yeah, it's leather ropes and then a sheepskin there, and that's where the infant would be taken care of. Also, this is not, it wouldn't be a one-woman enterprise. This would be all the women who are part of this extended group. So there would be young ladies outside, mothers of the children or not, who would be responsible for grinding the corn, for making sure that the foods are taken care of, the pot of beans is taken care of, making tortillas every day. Every day you had to do this. And it wasn't as if everyone got the dinner bell and got to come in for breakfast or lunch. Men would be going outside as soon as it was bright enough to be able to see where they would be hoeing. The women were grinding their corn, making the breakfast, and people would come in as opportunity lent itself to eat. That's what would be going on primarily all day long. They would come in when they were hungry, and they would go out again working. In the smaller communities, we're talking again at that framework in this particular circumstance, we're talking about the 1600s. Okay. People were not able to afford to live in single-family units till much later in our history. So in the 1700s going into the 1800s, well-off people would be able to have a group of sheep. They would be able to have their own ranchito and have their house with wooden floored boards. And that was just a matter of the increasing wealth in the community. So I'm steaming well here, but I'm not browning. So
Frances, you mentioned peeking into an horno is ill-advised. Is that because the baked goods would collapse?
well, especially when we have an horno that wasn't very hot to begin with. We want to conserve as much heat as possible. But since we were getting such a nice odor of baking bread, I risked it.
It smells amazing out here.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not sure that we're going to have much luck with demonstrating our bread, but up to this point, one can understand that this was not an easy undertaking along the lines of simply turning on the oven and mixing up a quick bread and putting it in. That was nowhere near what was required to feed your folks back then.
Sounds like it would have been an all-day enterprise,
Yes.
sort of in a around-the-clock. Would these hornos be sort of lit all day during these times?
They would not. They would have, like I said, it takes a whole lot of your family's resources to start a good-sized fire in there. You have to go haul wood, and that, in lots of areas, is not very accessible. In this area of Santa Fe, people had to go to the mountains to go haul wood for posts, wood for houses, wood for burning, and that's a good day's ride out, a day's work there, and then a day coming back. So they would have had to have everything lined up to go into the oven as soon as it was ready to go. So that's that.
Timing certainly is everything in this production here.
Mhm. Yes, it is. It's very much timing. Yes. And I'm not sure what else I can talk to you about.
Well, let's take some questions from our audience while we're waiting for this wonderful bread to bake. Audience, if you have any questions for Frances about the horno, about the baking process, about Las Golondrinas, please put those in the comments now. Frances, could you talk a little bit about, you talked a little bit about the miel, the sorghum, and the supplies. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the supplies they would have needed to make the bread, like their yeast or their flour, before the mills came in?
Well, at that point, you're grinding on the metate with a mano. So that is a very time-intensive, work-intensive situation, just like anybody who's seen the same process used for corn. And of course, you're raising your wheat, threshing it, and grinding it by hand. So those are all very intense work for the entire group. So not only mom, but the kids. And of course, Dad's probably the one that's farming all this stuff. So that's what you're doing. And of course, you're also going to be trading for other items. For instance, salt. Salt and spices and such like that are going to be coming up in the Camino Real. So those are all items for barter. As I'm sure that if you have a good crop of wheat, you can probably barter either the wheat or the bread as it's produced. Those are good things there. Life was very different. Life was very difficult. So, anything else?
We got a lot of interaction from our audience here. We got a New Mexico teacher in the house with us.
Nice.
Welcome, Tomas. Thank you all for joining us. Several of your Las Golondrinas volunteers. We're sorry about this, folks. These demonstrations, they're a little hard to time. Usually we do these demonstrations live with visitors coming to the rancho. But today we just had to get the horno running and hope that the timing would work out. It is, as Frances has talked about, a kind of a time-sensitive and delicate process. We have a question from Tomas, who's our New Mexico history teacher. He says, typically, how long would it take to make the horno itself? Good question.
Well, I'm not sure how you want to time it, because anybody that's made adobes knows that that's a significant time process there. I mean, you're going to have to make your adobes with your frames, and it'd probably take you a couple of weeks to make enough adobes for a good-sized horno. And then making your horno, depending on how fancy you want to be. I've seen some people that make their hornos with little benches and tables attached to them made out of adobes. And those are all wonderful items in our modern world. But I can suspect that if you're going to be building an horno, you can probably dedicate 4 or 5 days of labor. The adobes have to be trimmed so that they'll make a nice wedge shape, and you'll be plastering the inside as you're going up, because heaven forbid you're going to be on your back on the inside of this thing trying to plaster once it's finished, and then plastering on the outside. As many of our volunteers here will note, the exterior of the horno has to be replastered with mud once a year, because like everything else, mud gets a little wet and it runs down the side. So I would say about a week, not including making adobes.
Absolutely. Like anything else historically in New Mexico, it was quite a process, quite an endeavor.
Yes.
Here at Las Golondrinas, these are built by our operations team, by Sean and his employees, and they do replaster every year to make sure that they're up and running for us. And we brought them out of retirement for today so that you could come and bake for us. But in the winter months, like Frances says, any kind of snow or moisture can be hazardous to an horno, so they are covered with tarps for the winter.
Yes. Yes. Well,
Frances, can you tell us a little bit about the shape of the horno? Why it's this beehive shape, and if that's
I have
necessary
nothing
for
but
cooking?
conjecture and happy glib lies to give you about that. I have no real reason other than the fact that it would probably be an easy shape to make, so that you could bake your food or dry your meats or make a fire. It holds the heat fairly well once it's nice and hot, except today. Okay. Oh dear. Okay. So we've got some bread that's cooking hotter in the back, which is just fine for me.
When you have several items in there at once, do you have to rotate them?
Yes, dear. We do. But getting them out is going to be interesting. Perfection is not something that happens with home cooking.
usually means they're delicious.
Yeah. Pies are going to go back in to the rear of the oven to finish off, as is one of the pans of bread. So give me a second here, and then as you can see, the door itself dried out from the heat. If you remember, it was quite soggy. Thank goodness to begin with. Let's see. So, we've got loaves of bread, rolls,
Frances, before metal pots and pans became available, you talked a lot about the incoming goods that came in with modernity and Americanization. What would they use to put their food items in to bake?
Our Native American friends were very good at making earthenware, and it wasn't a matter of simply making what they used. They understood who would buy or trade for materials and what they wanted. So bowls is not a shape that was commonly used in the Native American, but they made it because it was something that the Hispanic and the other people wanted and used. So commercially, they would make those and trade for those. And in terms of containers for baking, again, lots of times this stuff was just put in the bottom of the oven. Just a loaf of bread, put it in there. As you can see in a whole lot of the pizza places where they have fire brick on the bottom. So that worked for them. And I'm very happy with what's turned out today, at least at this point.
It's beautiful.
Yes. Yeah. And I'd be happy to share them with whoever was here. So that's what happens with our bread.
Wonderful, Frances. Do we have any other questions or comments from our wonderful viewers out there? I'm going to come back and join Frances here. Get closer to the warmth here and this wonderful smell. Frances, thank you so much for taking the time to come and do this demonstration for us. I also want to give a shout out to Sean and his operations team for taking these and making sure they were ready for our demonstration today and getting the fire going. Timing is a little bit difficult to get when you're trying to do a live session. Normally we enjoy the company of our guests who come and participate in these demonstrations, but we're really thrilled to at least be able to come to you via Facebook. If you notice, we've had a theme this month. If you've been joining our videos, we're sort of focusing on food and festive foods and traditions, and it also is Native American Heritage Month. So what a wonderful way to give a shout out to our Indigenous friends and neighbors and to talk a little bit about their cultural traditions and how they lent them to the Spanish in those early years. Remember, folks, if you have any questions after this program, continue to put them in the comments. We'll make sure to check them out. Share this with your family and friends on Facebook. And if they don't have Facebook, send them to youtube.com and let them type in Las Golondrinas channel right there in the search box. And we have all of our series of our Golondrinas live session videos there to enjoy and to share. And we hope that you enjoy these programs. And we look forward to seeing you again. If you're interested in learning more about the adobe making process, we did one a few sessions back with Sean Palahimo and Michael Romero Taylor, and they walked us through all the process of adobe making. And one more recently was our miller, Jerry Kerr, talked about the Molino Grande, which Frances touched a little bit about milling history. So make sure to check out our videos, tune in again next time, and in the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.